Bienvenue, monsieur Durocher. Comment va-vous?
Bonjour, je vais très bien. Et vous?
Eh bien, mais je tiens à dire que sont bientôt dans qui je avais parlé français. So we'll continue in English.
All right, that sounds fun.
Yes. So I invited you on to have a talk about French politics because I think that a lot of the online rightists, to describe it broadly, media tends to focus far too much on the Anglosphere, and there isn't a lot of interest in other European countries, their movements, what's happening there, the politics, and you're sort of, well, maybe overstating it, but you're sort of an expert on what's happening in France and so on, the French movement, French ideology, and so on. So maybe give a short introduction of yourself to the audience in case they don't know you.
Sure. I am a French American historian and journalist. I write for mostly American or Anglo American publications, but I am in contact with many people in the French and broader European Francophone scenes. You can find me on Occidental Observer, Countercurrents, the old Radix archives, but now I mainly write for the Unz Review.
Yes, which is quite a big website, I've noticed.
It is vast. Ron Unz has done what no Gentile oligarch has, and this is what they were supposed to do, which is more or less federate all of the, dissident voices, left and right, mostly of the right. And he's very open-minded and is fighting really for free speech.
Ans Review is a very interesting website. I've seen it being shared here in the Netherlands, even by liberal by the classical liberal definition, liberal right wing sort of types.
Mm-hmm.
And we've met, of course, in the past a few times. You spoke at an Erkebrand event once as well. 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. Yes. No, I've spoken at several Erkenbrand events, and your events are always very refreshing.
Well, I'm no longer with Erkebrand, unfortunately. There's been
Mm.
developments, but I do recommend them in a general sense. Yes. Anyway, so I wanted to invite you on because, well, it's like I said, it's generally been my observance that people don't know about what happens in France, the French movement, and so on, because, well, especially in the Netherlands, there's this very Anglophile perspective on things. I've met nationalists in the Netherlands who know more about American politics, the American system, American parties, than their own country. So, to kind of counter that very American-centric, Anglo-centric perspective, I've been inviting some people on. I've had Bjorn Christian Rodal on to talk about Norway. I've talked to Bayram about Portugal, and I'd like to go around the continent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the first thing people will, of course, want to know about is the yellow vests and the current political situation in France. Now, people will probably know, at least in vague terms, the yellow vest movement started over fuel prices and escalated into something else. Although what exactly it is, it's hard to say. Some say it's a right-wing movement, some say it's a left-wing movement. It's generally counter-establishment, you could say. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's lost momentum recently, but it still has managed to keep momentum going. Now, of course, France has a much larger protest culture than many other countries. It's pretty much annually that they riot and have strikes. So, but what are your? Do you have any perspectives or information you'd like to give on yellow vests from like a writer's perspective? How are they interesting to us? What sort of developments and so on can you give?
Well, indeed. No, I completely can sympathize with your comment about people's interest in U.S. politics. Anybody who speaks English well enough, it seems, will get very interested in that and very disinterested in everything else. But we are on the ground here, and if the American empire is very influential, but really we have to take action where we can take action. That is usually in our own countries. Um, so the French political scene, I want to say, is the same in one sense. It's the same as it has been for the last 30 years, since at least 1983, when the left wing ceased being a radical force And you basically have government tries to impose unpopular but arguably economically necessary reforms, and people protest against it. Then the government backs down somewhat and waters it down, and then it just more or less passes it, and we move on. And this is a cycle which has been continuing for, as I say, 30 years, and this is continuing that pattern. The Yellow Vests, I think you described quite accurately, are a motley bunch, and we have seen different emphases at different times. So there's been the fight for purchasing power, basically, and a kind of revolt of the white French, what we would call périurbain. So this is the suburbs, but not the suburbs in the Parisian sense of the ghettos, but the real suburbs. So the villages and the less developed, the areas which are falling behind. The areas which are becoming a bit of a rural desert and a suburban desert. And these are the people who protest against this fuel tax hike, which hit them disproportionately, of course. And it's been a very white movement and a very kind of mainstream people movement. Lots of old folks, lots of unemployed folks, but in general with no coherent ideology or even set of demands. Because Gibbs...
Would it be accurate to describe them basically as like the bottom 50% that are being left out by the neoliberal system, revolting against that system?
I think the whites who have been left behind, certainly. I think that's a huge part of it, and Gibbs is not an ideology or a political program. They got somewhere a little bit further when they started talking about direct democracy and referenda, and they started also getting slightly more political with a basically left-wing analysis of the media and of the French media system, which is a very tight-knit group of oligarchs and the state. It's a very, very small elite, which more, is all interpenetrated of, tech oligarchs, fashion oligarchs, Jews, and the state giving subsidies and regulating the thing. Right. And so people are aware that this exists. But beyond that, it hasn't really nationalist protests within as Yellow Vests. You have a lot of wreckers who have been destroying central Paris on a recurring basis. And now with a pension reform, which the government is trying to pass to raise the retirement age, you're also seeing a new wave of protests with not so much the Yellow Vests, but the trade unions. And I've seen some of those in the mid-sized cities.
That's in the context, of course, of, like you said, modernizing the French economy, but also trying to implement, of course, a sort of standardized EU, to standardize across EU countries some things. Like they're trying to implement, not income tax, but sales value tax, and so on, and pension age. They're trying to slowly standardize all that. And I think the pension age in France is, 56 or something?
No, it'll be higher than that. It'll be 60, 62.
Right. And in the Netherlands, it's 67, for example.
Yeah.
So the Yellow Vest movement actually got some imitation in the beginning. Here in the Netherlands, there was a short attempt to also launch the Yellow Vest movement, but it was pretty much a failure. I think at most 300 people showed up. And in England, I believe they also had a small imitation. So how effective would you say that they've been at getting, anywhere, whether that is politically or in culture or in the media or metapolitically or anything?
Again, it's hard to identify any very many constructive trends. Maybe some people have been politicized by this, particularly because of the police brutality, which in many cases has been quite shocking in terms of people losing their eyes and apparently defenseless people getting savagely beaten by Macron's police. But you get some new media personalities have emerged. You get some, Yellow Vest e-thoughts that have emerged and, make some cringy YouTube videos. You have, as I say, some left-wingers have emerged out of this. But I think the main more or less positive impact has been the unpopularity of the government. Right. Because Macron had been able to maintain himself at a reasonable level, and he's really collapsed in the last year or so to 30-25% popularity, which is really the how we say the incompressible minimum for a globalist president. There's 20-25% of the French population is the liberal elites, the metropolitan class, and they believe in this, and he will all support. But he has pretty much lost everybody else. So that's quite significant. It's also significant that, yeah.
Yep. Now, he was kind of elected as sort of not left nor right, because Front National stood a serious chance last time, and then there was what was it, Mélenchon, I believe, the communist or far leftist, who was quite popular as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of the compromise candidate, the establishment candidate, right? That's why he was elected at all.
He was. It was very interesting. I was a Macron skeptic when he first appeared on the scene. I felt this was media astroturf, and it was. He didn't have a mass following, but he had, fake youth movement, which was former Socialist Party apparatchiks appearing in the media and telling about how this was the new upcoming guy, and everybody bandwagoned with it as the media and the journalists in their inscrutable, to me, pack mentality seize on various fashion trends and amplify them. But this was enough to destroy the old French party system, because I had thought that this was the natural time for the socialists to collapse, which they did, and for a conservative who would, make some mild immigration noises to win in his place. But in the end, Macron was completely able to annihilate both the socialists and the conservatives and leave a really damaged and in shambles French party system, because his party dominates the National Assembly, but he doesn't have roots in the countryside. It doesn't have mayors. It's full of defectors from the Conservative Party and the Socialist Party, and it doesn't have much which unites it, really. So it's it's a dominant party, but it's quite a fragile and inchoate one.
So is it likely to survive another electoral cycle?
I don't know. The media have been more and more critical of Macron, actually. I don't know if they're getting ready to ditch this horse and go for another one. He still has some time, and the economy is doing reasonably well. But of course, Corona-chan is around the corner, so
yes, exactly.
We'll see how that goes.
Yes, that'll probably ruin Trump's chances of getting re-elected as well. It'll be interesting, at least. Macron, the establishment candidate, is as I understood. But the former Front National is that would be the conservatives then in your description.
Oh no! When I say conservatives, I was not referring to Front National. I did not think. I was just the mainstream center right.
Right. I didn't even know there was such a thing in France anymore.
Gaullists, but they are a shadow of their former self, I think. Because the problem with the Front National, or the Rassemblement National as it is now, the RN, they have a lot of problems, and I have never been very bullish on their presidential prospects.
Well, it was better under Jean. What was his name? The father.
Jean-Marie Le Pen, yes.
Jean-Marie Le Pen. He almost got close to being elected in the early 2000s, right?
Well, no, he never got close to being elected, but he managed to break into the second round once, and this caused an international crisis.
Right.
And it was really enormous. Jean-Marie Le Pen never was going to get elected as president, and as I say, in the second round, I think he got 18% of the vote. So Marine has gotten a lot better with, I don't remember, 33 or 35%, and she might be, I don't know if she will ever be in striking range. I see people, and they seem pretty stable in their deep political preferences, So 2/3 of French people do not like the far right, quote unquote. And I don't see why that would change in the last 5 years or the last 30 years until all the boomers die, essentially.
Economic crisis, as you said, could change things.
I'm not massively, as I say, I'm not bullish. I don't feel like they have a narrative which, I think she turns off 2/3 of people, and I don't think they have a narrative which can. I could be wrong. Maybe she can win the next one, but I'm skeptical. But where Jean-Marie Le Pen was a lot more interesting was that there was no real prospect of him becoming president, but there was a real prospect of him working with the mainstream conservatives and putting a permanent center-right / nationalist government in power, which arguably Italy could achieve quite soon, for example. And he was much more interesting metapolitically, because Jean-Marie Le Pen was always pushing the envelope. He's a fun guy to watch. He's a serious guy. What's that?
I said, indeed, I've read some of his songs, especially the things he said about the Algerian war. But yes, he was far more open and explicit and actually intellectual in his opinions.
He was also more intellectual, and you have to see the memes that they put out under his leadership. I mean, and one of them is a poster they used to put up, which is him wearing a Native American headdress.
Yeah, and what was the message?
Well, we are the indigenous people.
Ah, clever. Well, actually, let's get into that, sort of the current and former Rassemblement National. I assume you were aware of Marine, not Marine, but what is her cousin's name? The younger...
her niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen.
Right. She attended this conference with Yoram Hazoni, the National Conservative Conference in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, we both will be very skeptical of, I think. But what would be the relationship of the French sort of metapolitical rightist movements, such as embodied in the tradition of archaeofuturism and so on, such think tanks like Iliade, and I'm not very much aware of what exists beyond that, but what's the relationship between the metapolitical rightists groups in France and the former Front National?
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure the links are that strong. There is a lot of overlap in terms of personnel, perhaps. I think many of the people who, for example, the guy who founded the Institut Iliade is Jean-Yves Le Gallou, who was a senior FN official and a member of the European Parliament in the 90s. And he set up Iliade with Dominique Venner once he left the Front National for internal party political reasons. And there are, I know many of the younger guys in the RN who are, staff, and they certainly are very aware of, they're quite intellectual, actually, and they're very aware of Alain de Benoit and Faye and Venner. And they seem to lean more identitarian than to civic nationalist. But in terms of the actual cadres, the actual politicians, in terms of Marine Le Pen herself, I can't tell you very much. I'm not very inspired by what I see. There's maybe one or two intellectual guys there. The older guys who have left, like Bruno Gollnisch, were sounder in this respect. And Marion Maréchal Le Pen, in fact, she changed her name. She removed the Le Pen part of her name.
Did she indeed?
So now it's just Marion Maréchal. She has set up a school in Lyon for right wingers, people who want to be politicians. And many see her as the person who perhaps could overcome the Macron-Le Pen division and federate the center right. That she could be the personality who could do that. So in terms of what she does, what she'd said, yeah.
So they're absolutely not taking a position of being a vanguard in a metapolitical sense. They're trying to create a broad front.
I think she's clearly a politician. She's trying to exist, in the French scene not as an outsider, trolling the system or pushing the envelope, but trying to break the far right out of its ghetto.
Right.
I think that's what she's trying to do. And you could even criticize it as kind of like, grifting and Stephen Bannon style, just existing on the periphery kind of thing. I'm not, but I think she's getting. I think she's able to get a bit of right wing money from respectable people. I think that's kind of the game. are you too toxic to exist, or will some respectable people with resources give you support?
Well, you say existing on the periphery, but my perception of the French far right, so to speak, has always been that it is far more accepted and far more present in mainstream culture than in many other countries, especially compared to, say, the Netherlands or Germany, even in the United States.
So there has always been a strong party, the Front National, which has always existed as a marginalized party, but it has always dominated the discussion because it can get 10, 15, 20, 25% of the vote. And that means something for sure. So it's always been part of the discussion. It's never been completely suppressed and annihilated,
No, I also mean that
as in Germany.
I also mean
Yeah.
it's more part of society. There's more think tanks. There are more authors that are able to go into the media and discuss some of their idea, like Camus or Renaud Camus, for example, and so on. And as you mentioned, Venner and Benoit and so on. There's quite an intellectual scene. There's also, like the identitarians, there's a movement on the ground. I believe, there are some mayors from the Rassemblement National, right?
There's a few, yes.
Yeah. So I'd say it has more of a presence in the French society than in many, many other countries, where it's less marginalized. Of course, it's marginalized, but less so.
Yeah, that's probably true. And but maybe we have to distinguish the party from the metapolitics, because
Yes.
there are a few RN mayors, but it's not, the communists used to run huge amounts of communes, for example. They would have a very strong grassroots presence. The Rassemblement National has a few communes, and it's kind of exceptional when they do. And they're getting more, but it's still... So there isn't a strong... It's very much I would say, a media state phenomenon, that it's the brand which works. It's the brand which gets 20, 25% at the national level, or can get a bunch of MEPs at the European level. But it's not a party which actually exists in people's daily life. And that might be a problem. I don't know. But in terms of the metapolitics, we have a long tradition of right-wing thought. And I mean, arguably the French writers they're usually not very strong on racial issues, but they are very strong, I think, on what might be some deeper philosophical questions about what kind of regime do we want, on political philosophy. And there, de Benoit, who has done really good work on human rights and what do human rights mean, and should this really be the be-all, end-all of a regime. Yeah. Venner has done great stuff on the long European memory, on what actually is our identity, what actually is the continuity of our spirit and civilization over the last 3,000 years.
I think you could go even further back than that. For example, to go to Chateaubriand and Joseph de Maistre, who were, of course, the big conservative thinkers of their time, who no one really knows about. I mean, when people talk about conservative thinkers, they will often, and then I mean really proper conservative thinkers, they will often go to Germans like Spengler, Nietzsche in some senses, to Schopenhauer, these sorts of thinkers. They rarely resort to the French, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Metz, I think, is a real reference, but it's true that Spengler, Nietzsche, they have. Especially Nietzsche, maybe a progressive aspect, a futurist aspect, which can be missing if you're just a pure reactionary.
True, because yes, the Mestre and so on are of course monarchists, Chateaubriand monarchists indeed, very religious thinkers as well. They basically were Catholic monarchists who wanted to maintain and return to that system. It did not have indeed much. In their ideology, there is not much ways to work with technological development and societal change. This is true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned the identitarians. What's actually the relation with the identitarians and the broader French political scene? For example, who were they started by, and what sort of position do they hold in French society?
So I don't know who founded the identitarians, but they were led by a long time by Fabrice Robert, who managed to establish them in several French cities. So it's very, I would say, clustered. You have a strong movement in French Flanders, so in the north of the country, around Lille. You have a strong presence in the southeast at Nice. And it forms these kind of little regional subcultures. The identitarians are very good at being maybe a bit more subtle than the American racial movement.
Yes.
You know, we have been forced because of laws to be a bit sophisticated and, good optics, as they say. And they organize, so they organize boot camps, they organize gyms where you can work out and do boxing and MMA and things like that, self-defense. And they own bars, so I've been to the bar in Lille, for example, which is a very nice place called La Citadelle. And they do these, I believe it was one of the Flemish nationalists who described the identitarians as the right-wing Greenpeace. And he meant by that the spectacular demonstrations where they will occupy a European Commission building and put a identitarian banner on it, or this is something they did with the Austrian identitarians, which was set up a fence in the Alps and rent a helicopter to police the Alps for migrants.
They did covering the statue of Maria Teresa in a burqa once. They do very media.
Oh, really?
Yes, mediagenic actions. They were kind of like the identitarians are kind of the model for a lot of people to look to for like activism in the modern day, where you're not really looking to do mass demonstrations or having like manpower on the streets, but what you're trying to gather is photogenic imagery, and then you rely on social media to spread your message.
Absolutely, social media and the mainstream media, because they have to cover it. If you do this, they have to cover it, and they do it in such a way that it cannot be completely demonized. That many people, the regular people who see it, will probably sympathize with you. Yeah. So they are a presence. They have quite a bit of punch, given their size, and they are under pressure now. And this is maybe a message for the movements which push the envelope. For the action they took in the Alps, 3 of their leaders are being prosecuted, and they were sentenced to tens of thousands of euros in fines and jail sentences also. So this will be appealed. Difficult to translate. Basically, taking on the authority of the state, because they were policing illegal immigration when the state was not willing to, and this was a co-opting public authority.
Yeah, challenging the monopoly on violence, basically.
I mean, it's really quite ridiculous to say that private people cannot be involved in enforcing the law, and that's the issue. There are people who actually encourage illegal immigration and get people across the border without which is a violation of the law, and are not fulfilling the state's role, but actually contradicting the state, and they go off scot-free.
Yes, well, they don't.
And they're celebrated.
They don't contradict, of course, the spirit of what the state wants. Perhaps not the state, but at least the powers that be that control the state.
Yes, I think the metropolitan liberal class, which is the media, the judges, it's everybody, they have a certain outlook, for sure.
Yes. Well, it's, of course, sort of Moldbug's idea of the cathedral. I'm not sure if I need to explain that, but that's more or less what we're working with, sort of just class system that has a shared semi-spiritual worldview.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned actually suburbs, and that's another thing to go back a little bit. What's actually demographically and so on the situation in France? You hear a lot, of course, about the suburbs of Paris, which are basically migrant ghettos. But can you give any insights more broadly into the demographics of France, how it's regionally divided and so on, what sort of cultural divide there is as well, perhaps?
So it's always difficult to talk about the ethnic situation because we never have very sound statistics. But at this point, probably 1/3 of the babies born in France are non-white, and that would be overwhelmingly African and Muslim. And we know this based on the fact that they test these infants for sickle cell disease. And you would only test them if they are of an origin which would be at risk of that. And that's mostly sub-Saharan Africans and Middle Eastern and North African Muslims. They're concentrating in all the big cities, obviously the Parisian suburb, as you said, and also in Marseille, where they have pretty much overwhelmed the city, and more scattered just about everywhere. In terms of France more generally, it has the usual left-right, center-right, center-left divides that you see, with maybe the west of the country is somewhat more prosperous than much of the rest of the country, and tends to be more liberal in the left-wing sense.
So which regions would you say is national? Like, for example, which region would you say is really nationalist? Which region is really leftist? Like, for example, Brittany or Normandy, what would they be?
So they would be more leftist.
Yeah.
There are basically two nationalist regions, and that is the north and east, counting that as one region, which is a lot of post-industrial areas, so around Calais and Forbach, these places which have
Which
really
is funny,
suffered.
since the population there is ethnically Dutch, Flemish.
Well, there you go. Indeed. And then also the southeast, so around the whole Provence region. I don't know why, but it is where the Front National gets the most votes, is the northeast and the southeast.
Well,
It's relatively prosperous, the south.
Okay, well, post-industrial makes sense that the disprivileged would vote for the outsider, and choose for a more nationalist policy. Actually, considering that this is the border region with Flanders, is there any cooperation between the Flemish movement and the French movement? I imagine not, because there's a lot of historical enmity there. But maybe you have some insight there.
I don't know if there is much personal contact. The identitarians of Lille are quite self-conscious about their regional Flemish identity. So if you go to their bars or gatherings, you will often see Flemish flags around.
They primarily still speak French, I assume.
Yes.
Okay. That's interesting because
if there's actual human contact with actual Flemish, I don't know that.
I probably not, because the Flemish don't like even the Walloons, let alone actual Frenchmen most of the time. But that's an interesting phenomenon in that Walloons are, of course, ethnically Dutch, ethnically Flemish, but they speak French. And the French Westhoek, which is what you're talking about, the Calais, Dunkirk region, which have Dutch names because they used to be part of the Dutch dialect continuum, with the Dutch name for Calais is Calais, for example, and Dunkirk is, of course, Dunkirk. Up until the standardization of the French language, it was still spoken Dutch, and I think some areas Dutch is still spoken, especially by older generations. So the people there are ethnically Dutch, but they speak French. They probably do identify in some ways with the French state. But it's interesting to know that they also have this sort of Flemish regional identity.
Oh yes, yeah. And the French identitarians and nationalists really run the spectrum between the people who are, really French nation statists, let's say, and the people who are more European and regionalists, and who are quite hostile to the French state. So, for example, Boris Lelay, who is I don't want to overdraw the comparison, but he's kind of the French Andrew Anglin, but maybe more moderate. And he lives in Japan, and he has been sentenced in absentia to jail. So he's able to continue his work. And he's a Breton nationalist, let's say, who is pan-European and very much against the historic French state for what it has done to the regions.
Yeah, there's also this Bretonist separatist movement, right? And you've got the Basques, of course. Yeah. Actually, what you wanted to talk a little bit about this civic and state distinction in nationalism in France. Now, France, of course, generally the perspective from outsiders is that it's a very chauvinistic culture that's very proud, at least, of its language and its culture, and kind of looks down at other cultures because they're uncivilized, unrefined, and so on. But they don't tend to tie this to ethnicity. So you could say that the mainstream French attitude is chauvinistic, but it's also completely racially blind. So what are the sort of the dominant ideologies in France? You talked about regionalism, but maybe others as well.
Yeah, so you have in France the natural ethnocentrism that you see everywhere else, but what people tend to do is to channel that ethnocentrism into particular symbols. So in America, it might be Christian identity and abortion and guns and or even Zionism. And in France, it's been kind of mainstream, at least since this continuing after the Second World War. You had French politicians, for example, complaining about Americanization and calling it coca colonization, for example. And you had Charles de Gaulle, who really put France apart in the sense that he wanted France to be an independent nation state and to not be subservient to the U.S. in NATO. And you can find squares named after Charles de Gaulle, the airport, the aircraft carrier. He is really a huge reference still for the mainstream and for many nationalists. But it tends to get watered down and to become a kind of linguistic chauvinism. And the French are very proud of their language, and they have laws to try to limit the amount of English on the radio. And the older generation, their ethnocentrism basically, as I say, became this kind of obnoxious linguistic obsession where they think, well, you speak French and that's kind of enough. I mean, in terms of ideology, France, we can say, founded modern nationalism with the French Revolution. Yes. And it's not coincidence if so many nations have tricolor flags, where people realize that when you have a state which represents a people and tries to create a people, because in the French case, it's never been a linguistically homogeneous society, you have a very powerful polity, because you have a polity which the citizens identify with the nation, they identify to a certain extent with the state, and you can have very powerful mass armies and a cohesive society in this way.
Which we can pretty much squarely blame on Louis XIV's centralization policy and 70 years of rule, basically. He transformed the very regionalist France of Henry IV into the sort of central state that it still is to an extent today.
Absolutely. He broke the back of the nobles, and he paved the way for the revolution, for sure, and the over-centralization of France, which is definitely a phenomenon. But because of the revolution, we have this nation-statist ideology really since then, the idea that you should have a state, and then you should format the people to be a coherent nation, and therefore any immigrants or any outlying regions should be assimilated to the national type. And this is the basic framework for the National Rally, even today. They are civic nationalists, basically. They're not very explicit on anything else. And there's a big risk that they would, if they were in power, would just get involved in a bunch of Brexit-style anti-EU economic shenanigans, which would be very exhausting and largely counterproductive. So that's the main influence on the National Rally, I would say. It's an authorized kind of pseudo-nationalism. And you have what has been a big countercultural presence, one which influenced me a huge amount because I was consuming their stuff, which is Alain Soral's anti-Zionist and civic nationalist movement, Égalité et Réconciliation. And they very much follow this line of thinking.
I see. And are there any still regionalist movements of any significance? I mean, the Bretons, I believe, but other than that?
I don't know depends what you mean by significance. There is a sense that in the mainstream they are starting to teach the regional languages more, and you often have bilingual signage in the regions. You have Corsican mafiosi and terrorists who are still active and occasionally murder a prefect or do some, or actually, for that matter, keep refugees out. So the Corsican mafiosis and low trust, clannish tendencies has its disadvantages and its advantages. But you don't have much politically. So even the Breton, I don't think there's any risk of them becoming like Catalonia and starting to, dominate the national discussion in Spain and have constant, again, more or less pointless strife over, regional autonomy.
Right. Then again, Catalonia is almost half of Spain and the most economically wealthy area, whereas Bretagne is, it's like vineyards and fishermen, and it's not really a massive part of France.
Yeah, and it's quite successful economically, but the thing is that they just don't have a movement, And what the Spanish did, which is the mistake which everybody does, and they really shouldn't do, but they do it because they're not principled people with clear thinking, which is that they gave the Catalans a parliament, just like the Brits gave the Scottish a parliament, which is just an invitation for more autonomy, because you're going to give autonomous politicians the institution by which they can get elected and say that they have a mandate to break up the national state.
Right.
So, this is what people do.
Well, in the context of regionalism and so on, and federalism, what's the French attitude towards the EU?
Oof. Well, which French are we talking about?
Well, let's start with the nationalist French.
Well, you have again this civic nationalist to identitarian spectrum where everybody's going to be anti-EU, right? Everybody will be anti-EU.
Yes, but
many will be.
Would they want to dismantle it, or would they want to reform it? Because
that's
France
the thing.
does generally benefit and is a dominant force in the EU.
Well, many French people would disagree about the benefits, because they will say, well, we have to pay for the Eastern Europeans, we have to compete in terms of wages, our factories will get outsourced over there. So these are some common talking points. I would say, if people like Dominique Venner or people like Guillaume Fay generally would welcome the EU in principle and say that we shouldn't try to dismantle it, but that we should simply take it over at some point. Yeah, and that if a majority of European... It is... I don't know how hard it is. I think if you have a majority of European states that are identitarian or nationalist, then probably the institutions would eventually follow.
Yes,
it might take some time.
There's, of course, the factor that what kind of nationalism? Because if I were to take quite a significant part of the Flemish and Dutch nationalism, we have the Flemish more so than the Dutch, but there is enmity towards the French, for example. There's among the Dutch nationalists, the general sentiment is pro-German, anti-French, and there's also this sort of irredentism of wanting to have Alsace-Lorraine back for Germany, to want French Westhoek back for Flanders, and so on. So, if you get nationalist countries in the EU, you could have all these old issues flare up. I mean, everyone has these sort of disputes. You mentioned Spain and Catalonia, but then you also have Hungary, which has its Trianon obsession, and you've got Austria, Venice, Tyrol, and Italy, and so on and so on. So if you get that sort of nationalism you couldn't maintain a union, probably.
Well, I mean, this is where the globalists, laugh and have a point, where they say, if you guys were in charge, it would just be even more of a bickering mess. And that might be true. I mean, I think the problem with the nationalists in this sense, and these are national populists, I'm talking about RN, AFD, the semi-mainstream nationalists who have a shot at being in government, which is that, they usually lack any kind of coherent ideology, let alone a pan-European ideology, because they're not explicitly racialist. If they were racialist, they might be more pro-European, actually. So that's point one. And point two, they exist because of the democratic system. So they exist when they trigger, 10, 15, 20% of the voters to vote for them based on the local ethno-national obsessions. And these are often, kind of pointless stuff like, forcing Muslims to now wear headscarves. Yeah. Right? It doesn't matter. They're here. The point is not whether they wear a headscarf. The point is that they're here.
Yes.
So that's going to be, and often you will get, so this is what we call race baiting, and it's what the democratic system encourages. It's what the media encourage. They encourage these kind of sterile polemics, and
But
we want
that's
to
the whole
avoid that.
thing with the media. Always is they try to keep the discussion to the lowest common denominator. It's absolutely stuntifying sometimes the level
Oh yeah.
of discourse that things occur on, where someone's the populists as much as the left, right? The left are constantly crying about racism and pointing at the little things. There's never any discussion in the world of ideas or ideology or anything. It's always it's almost clickbait. The discussion.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 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 That's well put.
Yeah, people put out this sort of one-liner, and then they counter with another one-liner, and then disavow, condemn, that, and it never gets anywhere really.
No, and the level is deteriorating.
Yes.
When you see the Russia conspiracy theories, which are now basically mainstream across the whole of Western media, or when you see, I've been actually quite, I don't know, demoralized, or I don't want to say surprised. I guess surprised at how low humans can go with the latest identity politics stuff. Namely transgender and sexual equality. So I actually think Emmanuel Macron as a president is a fairly interesting guy. Like, I think he is mildly autistic, and he therefore understands certain facts without talking about them.
He's technocratic. He's very technocratic. In a way, I think in an American analogy, you could say he's like my Bloomberg, where he's like, I don't really care about ideologies. I care about what's practical.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a great comparison. And however, he has appointed a insane white, affluent, female, liberal social justice minister as Minister for Equality. And she is like, she changes it on the birth certificate from mom and dad to parent one, parent two. Yeah. She has banned the use of the term Miss in official context, mademoiselle, which is, again, another destruction of poetry in this world. You have the mayor of Paris, who is another affluent white female liberal who is adding inclusive writing to which is basically changing the way words are spelt to a very ugly form so that you cannot tell if it's male or female.
And the
so
French language is, of course, gendered, so...
It's all gendered, and it's not meant to be neutral. It cannot be made neutral without really, and in some cases, making words unreadable. So this is what we're facing, and it's more and more the case.
It does show the power of basically memes of metapolitics, because these people have no electorate. These people have no real power in the sense of having the backing of the masses, or really having... I mean, there's money behind them in a sense, but not directly. It's all indirect. The moneyed interests aren't interested in pushing them. They just use them to advance other agendas in a way. But their power is almost purely cultural.
It's cultural, and it's institutional, and it seems to be the weak psychology of 10%, of our 10% of, reasonably smart, verbal IQ, whites, and not only them, obviously, but the HR managers, the HR managers just believe...
The 115 IQ people who can get a university degree through repetition and rote learning, but aren't very creative or...
something like this, yeah.
Thinkers, yeah.
They have a childish view of life. They are completely... And I've spoken to them, and I've worked with them, and I know what they're trying to do, and it's nuts, They're just completely at war with nature. They really think that if we just get the whole culture to deny male and female roles, that we're going to be happy, and it's crazy, And I'm like, these people need to be forced to watch nature documentaries and do some...
No, but they're...
Evil Psych 101.
That's what university does. They've been especially well conditioned in not connecting facts unless told to connect them. So they can watch a nature documentary and observe that might is right and that Darwinian selection occurs and sexual selection occurs, but they have somehow learned to never be able to reconnect that to their own personal experiences or their personal lives. It's quite amazing, this
Indeed,
disconnect.
indeed.
And yeah, there's of course the 90 IQ masses who just rely on their instincts, who are sort of underbelly nationalistic, but can't formulate that into a proper worldview.
Indeed, and you have quite a few, and this has been a new occurrence. I would say low quality nationalist social media personalities who, can get a certain amount of following, but really are, I would argue, are kind of a turnoff.
Yeah, we've had this here too.
They make us look bad.
Yeah, well, but I think about 3 young blonde women who have attracted a huge following simply for being young blonde women, who sort of repeat the talking points of the populist leadership, and then whenever they don't know the party line, they'll fall back on liberal notions like, "Oh, I'm not racist. I've got black friends."
Well, we all want e-thoughts. Everybody loves the e-thoughts.
I'm afraid it's true. Nothing is easier in this modern day and age than being a young, attractive woman. But to get into a bit more deeper the philosophical things, we were talking about EU a bit, and what I find interesting, especially about the French, is that they've got modern, interesting thinkers, like we've mentioned Venner, Benoit, Fay, etc., etc. Something you don't see almost anywhere else. I mean, you've got a few Americans. You could say Pat Buchanan is interesting. But generally, most countries don't have, especially numerous intellectuals that are presenting a reactionary or rightist critique of modernity and so on. You can find a handful there. You've got, for example, Linkola in Finland, but he has his own little environmentalist niche thing, right? But France has this actual sort of school of reactionary, let's say, thinkers, and has this ideology, of course, archaeofuturism, which I find very interesting. This combination of technology and tradition.
Yes.
And we could go into discussing the EU and sort of pan-Europeanism there, in that those French thinkers are generally transcendental of the idea of petty nationalism of just the state.
Yes. I don't think any other country has such a wide selection of top quality thinkers, and I think the Americans are strong on all the racial aspects. So people like Lothrop Stoddard, or you mentioned Pat Buchanan, Kevin McDonald.
That's the 30s. I mean, in the 30s, I could also grab a selection.
Oh yeah,
of Germans
for sure,
or Russians, but these days in modern times, it's very rare.
You have no, they're good on the biology, but they don't have, generally speaking, more deep philosophical references. And I think this might come down to that philosophical education in France was very strong, and maybe even still is fairly strong. And the thing is, if you study any philosophy and you study any of these thinkers, you have Rousseau, you have Marx, they exist. But is that the main line of thought? Is that we don't take nature seriously, that we don't take human nature seriously, that we don't take inequality seriously? No, the main line of thought with Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism is to each their own, to each their place. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons why there are so many of these French thinkers who really critique what has happened since 1789 in a very deep way.
It's also maybe because it's the source. But to put it bluntly about Americans is you cannot expect a country with no culture to have cultural critiques.
It's tough. Yeah.
No, but maybe you could tell a little bit about, for example, the perspectives of Venner and Fay and so on, because I'm of course so familiar with them to an extent. I'm personally am an adherent in many ways of archaeofuturism, although I would, of course, not being French but Germanic, I would incorporate far more social Darwinist perspectives into that as well. So I have my own little synthesis of these ideas, but perhaps you could expound on what archaeofuturism and so entails.
I mean, I could talk about Venner in particular. So he was a historian. He was enlisted in the Algerian War, and he wanted to keep Algeria French. He wanted to defend the 1 million European settlers who were in Algeria, and the pieds noirs, as they're called, the Blackfeet, possibly because they wore shoes. It's not really clear. And they were of diverse European origins. You had Alsatians, Corsicans, Spaniards, as well as French. And he was radicalized by that conflict when Charles de Gaulle gave up Algeria.
As indeed many were.
As many were. And he was arrested for trying to participate in a coup or even assassinate the president. It's not really clear. And after that, he dedicated himself to metapolitics and to recovering the long memory of the Europeans, which he saw very much in a, as I say, in a shared perspective. He was not a petty French nationalist or anything like that. He was all about the Greeks, the Romans, the Iliad, the Chanson de Roland, but also to the modern Europeans like Ernst Jünger. And he saw a common rebirth of the European peoples, but which, of course, he couldn't predict what it would do, how it will be, and we still don't know how it will be. But he lived to a fairly old age, and as your listeners might know, committed suicide a few years ago in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, in protests partly against the gay marriage law they were passing at the time, but really against immigration.
Yeah, sort of a statement that, I mean, in a way, it's a very French statement. I mean, romantic suicide is part of French literature, is very, very, very much part of it.
I think he was partly inspired by Yukio Mishima.
Yes.
And wanted to do a similar action as to look death in the face and make a statement. And indeed, as you say, a kind of protest. And he was waiting. I mean, one of his last books, it was called Breviaire des Insoumis, the breviary for the unbowed, let's say. And the subtitle was something like For European Samurai. He wants knights to be back. He wants people who have that daily discipline and no fear of death. Obviously, that's not the society that we live in today, but maybe these people will return.
No, I can go into a few ways here. This, for example, Dutch and German nationalists are often inclined towards a more insular idea of nationalism. They don't generally like the idea of a federalized Europe or a white identity or anything like that. This probably has a lot to do with the fact of the history of the Holy Roman Empire, but in a way as well, because if you would have a united country embracing all Germanics, so you'd have Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, maybe Switzerland, you'd have a huge power block, industrially, demographically, that could go into the world geopolitically on its own. Would you perhaps think that part of the idea of transcending petty nationalism from the French has to do with that France is maybe not strong enough to stand on its own on the world stage anymore?
Yeah, that's probably a fair observation to make. I mean, I think the elephant in the room in all kinds of pan-European nationalism is, or pan-European federation, is of course the diversity within Europe. And so obviously, I mean, if you look at, people don't want to talk about it, but if you look at the history of European integration, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Spanish, why do they get involved? Because they want to, have the money and the competence of the Northern Europeans. This is the whole game. I mean, you see the Italians, for example, they joined the euro because they wanted to get the German, let's say, discipline in the macroeconomic sphere. This is what the policymakers want. They wanted to constrain their own governments, which is a very undemocratic thing. But if you have a slight Nordicist reading, it makes you can't make sense of the way the European Union has evolved without a slight Nordicist reading.
Well, you could definitely say that the North, Germany, of course, especially, but I mean, the top leaders of the EU are all Belgians, Dutch, and Germans. So, and Germany is, of course, the dominant power. But you could very much say that the EU, at least monetarily, has, of course, the euro is a failed project. It's going to drag us into a serious economic. It's already slowed economic growth, but it's going to drag us eventually into serious economic problems. But I do think the EU, in certain administrative things, is a workable idea. For example, one of the things that it actually does do well is infrastructural development throughout Europe. It has unlocked regions. It has helped, especially like in border states. It's with, for example, getting railways and roads and so on built, and canals especially. And the standardization of many industrial things, for example, electrical norms and so on. These things are good, but you could do all that without having a parliament and a political project associated with it, of course.
So, would you be in favor of its continued existence, or would you prefer something Germanic?
Well, I'm, of course, in favor of a Germanic Union, a sort of revived Holy Roman Empire, which would embrace all the Germanic peoples and have sort of regional decentralized government, because I think we could go our own way into the world, because we'd have a population of about 140 million Germanic people. We'd have the strongest industry, no, not worldwide, but competitive with the United States, perhaps not with China. But then again, Chinese manufacturing is completely dependent on having access to markets in Europe, which you'd have to shut down at that point. So I think we could go our own way as Germanics. I think the Mediterraneans and the French perhaps could do their own little thing, such as a sort of what the Spanish Empire was,
A Latin Union.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. I think there's too much difference between the Northerners and the Southerners for a complete, especially political and cultural union to work, financial especially not. But there are...
Yeah, that's an interesting possibility. I would agree the EU has been quite successful in some areas, especially in terms of trade, where the EU is a real economic bloc. And also, depending on your point of view, in terms of European immigration to Western Europe, where you have all these Polish plumbers or Romanian doctors,
Yes.
which some people might oppose.
Well, my economic
But,
analysis would be that especially Schengen and the euro together have ensured basically that the South and East, the South at the moment and the East is becoming this. The Balkan region especially is becoming basically, you know how the old colonial and metropole system worked, where the metropole is where everything is manufactured and all the industry and so on is, and the colonies basically produce raw materials and are markets for the refined goods of the metropole. That's sort of what the North and the South and East is becoming. The metropole is the North, and the South is becoming a source of base raw materials and also very much cheap labor for the North. And this is not, for the North economically, this is good. However, culturally, it is not so good, because it, of course, it disrupts our culture. It destroys identity and local community and tradition and so on. For the South, it's economically ruinous, of course, not because they have brain drain, they lose their youth, they have no manufacturing capability, they become markets for the North, they have no own industry. So I do not see this as a positive in any way, this inter-European migration.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I think it seems to be making the Western system more viable in the medium term, at least. Personally, I would say the Franco-German connection is very important. And in terms of the European migrants, you are changing the genetics to an extent, so you might oppose that on those grounds alone. But I think in the medium term, it won't be a problem in terms of assimilation, because you see that in the French experience and the American experience. But in any case, I think for the foreseeable future,
You say that.
we're not. we're not going to see much of interesting geopolitically from Europe.
Well, you say that, but I mean the traditional cultures of America, the Anglo-Saxon North and the Dixie South, were destroyed by immigration of Italians, Poles, and so on.
Perhaps. I mean, I think it led to a different nation. Whether and it was a nation. I don't know that the old WASP style, sort of township democracy, was it destroyed by the Poles and the Italians, or was it destroyed by the Industrial Revolution and high finance?
Both. I'd say that the high finance, of course, destroyed the possibility to have the sort of landed aristocracy lifestyle. But certainly the destruction of the culture and tradition had a lot to do with the mixing of neighborhoods. I think, what's this Catholic thinker's name again? E. Michael Jones has an interesting book about this, the destruction of cities. Although that's already in a later period when there's already the presence of these sort of cultures.
Indeed.
Yeah. Another thing we could get into is, you're familiar with Dugin, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Aren't there quite similarities, sort of? Perhaps not in exact content, but between archaeofuturism, the French perspective, and Duginism.
I don't feel competent for that question in the sense that I don't know enough about Duginism, but I would say that there are some affinities, not so much with archaeofuturism, but with Alain Soral's movement. Alain Soral is the primary French publisher of Dugin, and they share a basically Nazbol sensitivity, sensibility, let's say, yes. Where, I mean, you can please tell me what your assessment of Duginism is, but speaking of Soral, there's this Nazbol sensibility where there is this absolute loathing for the bourgeois and for liberalism.
Yes.
And which leads to, on the one hand, indeed a French civic nationalism, and on the other, this pseudo-traditionalism, where he'll support every Catholic, every Orthodox, even also Muslims. Mm-hmm. But when he himself is clearly not a spiritual person and is, a post-68 left-wing punk, and it's more out of resentment and against the liberals and a certain nostalgia. And I get a similar vibe from Dugin in the sense that I can't really pin down what the heck he is about.
I sort of agree with what you're saying. They're sort of, Dugin and the French traditionalists are anti-bourgeois, anti-liberal. That they have shared, the Nazbol thing you say, although it's broader than that. Another thing I see is that they kind of transcend the idea of nation states. Dugin, of course, his focus is the sort of Eurasia, the Central Europe and Caucasian, sort of Caucasian parts of Russia. That whichever power dominates that area would become global world hegemon simply by sheer amount of resources and demographics presence in that area. But that's not really relevant to what I mean by the similarity with the French traditionalists. It's more the transcendence of the sort of idea of the nation state, that they want to abandon that. They're more global, more imperial thinkers in a way.
But is Dugin the Russian Asian imperialism?
Yeah, Eurasia. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's basically an ideology for the influence of this state. Yeah, which is a bit different from archaeofuturism, where it really is positing something quite new in the sense that there is no single nation in the Euro-Siberian concept which is dominant, because you would have Russia, Germany, and France. The EU is the Franco-German core, but it's even outgrowing that and is kind of, headless at this point.
Yes, but basically what the EU is, as just it is now, is a predominantly, if you're talking about liberal bourgeoisie, The EU is a liberal bourgeois project, and has mainly an economic focus. It's technocratic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although, in a sense, I think technocracy isn't necessarily a bad system as long as you have people, the technocrats in charge, having some connection to the people they rule over, which of course our elites at the moment do not at all.
Indeed, and they don't understand what a European is, and so they think Europe is a supermarket. Yes. Or a kind of airport where it's meant to be a zone, and in that zone you have individuals who are more or less taken care of by the state, and otherwise are completely undifferentiated and rootless and floating. And this is their basic operating assumption, and so you get results you get.
Indeed. Maybe to conclude, you could give a little overview of. If anyone who speaks French wants to learn more about the French movement, what they can sort of look to for websites and books and authors and think tanks, movements, and so on.
For sure. So for media, those who speak French, there's the French Breitbart, or not Breitbart, more like the French Drudge Report, let's say, is a website called F de Souche. F de Souche, which is a kind of press review with all the news stories that are relevant from an identitarian perspective. Then you have Égalité et Réconciliation. It's quite a good news site where you get more of the anti-science perspective. And so you get a lot of stuff on the infamous lobby from that website. And then if you speak well enough, or if you can hear well enough, I do strongly recommend video. There is a lot of excellent French video content. Alain Soral's videos are, at least, no, I haven't rewatched them in a while, but they're very compelling. It was part of my transformatory experience. Jean-Marie Le Pen's interventions in the media, going for decades, have always been funny, have always been powerful, and I think are worth checking out. And for books, I mean, there's all the authors that we mentioned, and maybe too much to mention.
Right. Okay, I think covered most of sort of introduction to French ideology and politics to anyone who isn't really informed. So thanks for coming on, Guillaume. Maybe we'll see each other again in the future. And congratulations on becoming a father, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Indeed, it is a great source of joy. Yeah. And I wish everyone well, and to take care of themselves. That's you can't be of good to others if you are not taking care of yourself.
Many people having children recently in the movement around me. I'm really feeling the pressure there.
Yeah. What kind of pressure?
Oh, I'll have to have children as well, of course.
Yeah, well.
Not bad pressure, perhaps. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on. And,
thank you, Vasa.
Good evening.
Jeune Seigneur et ton œuvre splendide, un cœur de feu, une âme de guerrier, tu le donnas à la Vierge timide, que tu voulais couronner de laurier. Sainte Jeanne de France, notre espérance repose en vous. Sainte Jeanne de France, priez, priez pour nous. Jeanne entendit dans son humble prairie des voix du ciel appeler au combat. Elle partit pour sauver la patrie, la douce enfant à l'armée commandant. Sainte Jeanne de France, notre espérance repose unique espérance, du haut des cieux